Everybody, this is your main man, Anthony Brogdon on Strong Inspirations. And let me tell you, my brothers and sisters around the world, I got a smooth guy on the channel today. He's smooth, he's smart, he's dedicated to help people throughout his career. And you're gonna hear the story today. I'm super excited that he has come on Strong Inspirations. Now, let me tell you this. He can't hear me. I like all my guests, and I'm impressed with all my guests who come on here. I'm very impressed with this gentleman. And let me tell you what happened was, I do what I can to find people. I Googled civil rights attorneys. His was the first name that came up. Boom shakalaka. His was the first name. Now there's other names and there's other people I'm reaching out to. His was the first name that came up, and I sent him a message. He said, man, let me get back with you. I'm doing my thing. And then he said, okay. And I'm super excited. I'm not gonna go long because I know he's running. He's doing his thing. He's doing what he do. Hit the subscribe button on Strong Inspirations. My numbers is up. Hit the like button on this video because you're getting it straight from the man who did it. So he know what he's talking about. I'm just gonna ask a couple questions. Hit the notifications bell for when the videos come up, you get notified. I just got a couple things to say. Did you see that video I did with the guy who's a descendant of the last slave to be brought to America? Watch that video. His great-great-great-grandfather was on that ship, and they just found the ship. They went down there and got into Mobile, Alabama. You got to watch that one. Did you see the one I did with the lady out of that plantation out of Florida that said that the guy who owned it was a slave trader and he was married to a Black woman? Unbelievable. They can't keep their hands off them sisters. Watch that one. There's a bunch of them on there. I'm going fast because I want him to come on. I'm a filmmaker, my friends. I'm serious about it. It's called Business in the Black, The Rise of Black Business in America. I want you to watch this. It's streaming on Amazon. And I took it the next step and I wrote a book. It's called Black Business Book. It's got over 200 facts. It's amazing things. One of the things, and this gentleman here is an attorney, one of the things we talk about are the first Black considered, and I'm sure it's probably true, they're considered the first Black attorney in America, licensed attorney. You got to watch that, and the law firm that he started. It's in my book. I got a bunch of good things. I got people that say, man, I didn't know none of that stuff. Here it is, and I make it real easy for you to read. All right, one more thing. You know, I got my own festival in Kansas City, Kansas, Memorial Day weekend. Yes, little old me, I ain't little no more, and I'm not little after this gentleman has come on the channel. I'm big, and all them other people, because it's over 250 videos on the channel. I'm not little no more. Come to my festival. Just figure me out. Go to my website, businessintheblack.net. Now, you hear me use that term strong a lot. Strong stands for strength, tenacity, resilience, and a sense of oneness, nobility, and grace. And that is my introduction to my guest today. He's a strong man. Let me tell you something. This guy played hockey. So that means he's tough. That means he's tough. I saw that when I looked him up, you know what I mean? Because I got people that said, man, you got him on the channel, you really hit me, along with my other guests. He played hockey. So, sir, would you introduce yourself? Let's get it on. I thank you so very much for coming on Strong Inspirations.
Hello, my name is John Britton.
Mr. Britton, you're an attorney.
I am an attorney and a law professor.
And a law professor. Before we get into some of the story, let me ask you a couple questions. Where did you grow up?
In Norwalk, Connecticut, Fairfield County, 1 hour drive out of Manhattan, New York.
Do you know how your folks got there?
Yes. My parents migrated from the South to the North in a very unusual way. This, of course, was called the Northern Migration, Midwestern too, of African Americans who were leaving Jim Crow segregation and degrading of them in the South. My parents, though, were unique. My father was the butler, the bartender, the chauffeur, the boat captain of a small yacht, and the pilot of a small plane. And my mother was the maid and the nanny and the general caretaker around the inside of the home for a man named Candler Dobbs. And Candler Dobbs was the president and the chairman of the board of the Coca-Cola Bottling Company.
Oh, really?
They were domestic servants. And in the mid-1930s, Coca-Cola decided to join the New York Stock Exchange and moved their chief executive officer from Atlanta to New York. They came to New York, and Dobbs owned a big complex on Fifth Avenue, apartment condominium, we call them now. And my parents were the servants. After several years, he didn't like it in New York, so he moved to Connecticut, a place called Westport, Connecticut, and even a little subdivision in Westport called Naugatuck.
Okay,
And
let me interrupt you. And I don't mean no disrespect. Let's go back a little bit further, if you can, to your great-grandparents.
My great-grandparents come out of Georgia, southern Georgia, with a wee bit of a Cherokee Indian in them.
Oh, really?
African Americans.
And so, who talked about education? Who made you want to, become, get the good grades you did, and then go to law school? Was that, where does that start at?
I think my sister, who was 8 years older than I, was the greatest influence in me coming to college. Going back to hockey, when I played hockey at Norwalk High School in 1962, I was the captain of the team and the high scorer. And the lore around all of New England and New York was that I was the only Black high school hockey player in all of New England and New York. And some would say as far as they could see west to North Dakota. And as I was going through my final year, and certain little Ivy League colleges in New England were recruiting me to come and to play hockey, my sister had started at Spelman College in Atlanta, and then she transferred to Howard University. And when she came home around December or January, when my parents were going over these invitations to go play hockey and go to college, she said, hell no, you're not going to no white school to play hockey. You're going to go to a historically Black college. And I just said, okay. And that's how I went to Howard University.
Oh, so let me ask you this. As a result of your parents and your mother working for the guy at Coke, you saw high life?
Yes, I lived on a large mansion with a half a dozen old cars, not to mention the little limousine car. And I went out on the yacht boat with my dad, and he took me up in the little Piper Cub plane at times too. I saw what large wealth looked like, even though I was very young. I have more pictures than I have memory because I was born and lived there for 5 years. And then Dobbs lost his fortune and his position due to alcoholism. And so my parents moved from Westport, Connecticut to Norwalk, Connecticut. And that's where I grew up.
Let me ask you this, and I don't mean no disrespect in this question. I know a number of people who said their parents, or in particular their mother, worked for white people as their maid. Was that a proud position for her?
I think so, because she would go on with her catering business and services to work for very wealthy, well-known people like Walter Cronkite, who was a big CBS newscaster, like
Really?
Paul Newman, who was a big time actor, and many more like that that lived in the greater Southern Connecticut, Fairfield County area.
I love it.
For an
So
example,
that
my
meant that
mother
she was
worked for
polished.
a man named Ween, George Ween. And Ween was the leading shareholder in the Empire State Building Company.
Did you play with the white kids or the black kids or both?
I played with white kids and black kids, but from kindergarten to 6th grade, I was the only African American in the school for those 6 years.
Okay, well, that leads to one more, and we're gonna talk about some of the other stories. Did they pick on you?
Well, I had an interesting little group of neighborhood boys. One was a recent Israeli whose family immigrated to the United States. The other was of Italian background, and the third one was for English background. So we formed a little 4 musketeers,
Now,
one
they're
for all
white,
and
though.
all for one.
They're
And if
white.
anyone ever uttered an epithet of what they call Jewish people or Italian people or English people, the war was on and the fight started.
Okay, I got a good one for you. How about this one? And again, I just don't, I want to ask this. With your mother and your father doing what they did, were they ever disrespected where somebody slipped up, one of them rich guys, and called them a nigger or anything like that?
Not to my knowledge, but it wouldn't surprise me if they did, because racism was just as strong in the North as it was in the South. It just was not de jure segregation, it was de facto segregation.
As a result of growing up the way you did, how did the other black kids respond to you? Did they think that you were, because you were polished, you spoke well, you got good grades? What is that dynamic?
I always blended in with people for who they are and not how much money their parents made or what kind of physical life they lived.
Yeah.
And so I always got along with people very well.
When did you decide to go to law school?
I decided to go to law school during the 1960s. I went to Howard University from 1962 to 1966 in undergraduate school.
Okay.
And once Muhammad Ali came on campus,
Really?
and he said, no black man should fight a war started by a white man to kill the yellow man who hadn't done anything to the black man.
Yeah.
And we all raised our fist and said, right on.
Yeah.
And so I became a draft dodger because I didn't believe in the war in Vietnam. And I went to law school in 1966 solely to get another deferment like my white friends back in high school did, and to avoid the draft. And
so
that's
law
what
school
led
would
me
let
into
you do
going to
that.
law school.
Yeah. Where did you go to law school?
At Howard University in Washington,
Howard.
D.C. from 1969 to 1970.
Now, okay, this leads to this question. Growing up like you did, you probably didn't spend a lot of time with blacks, but then when you went to Howard, was that a culture shock? Did that open your mind? I'm sure it did, but in some respects.
It opened my mind, not because they were black, but because they were activists. For an example, Stokely Carmichael was a good colleague of mine during college.
Really?
And John Lewis came around, and so did Rap Brown. And as a result, during the height of the civil rights movement, and then later followed by the anti-war movement, I was in good company during the 1960s in Washington, D.C., and in social activism.
What is it like to be an activist? What does that mean? Do you come up with a cause and then you try to fight to help other people?
I am considered the 3rd generation of Charles Hamilton Houston. Charles Hamilton Houston was the Black Dean of Howard University. He was the architect of the Brown versus Board of Education theory that de jure forced racial segregation was inherently a violation of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause.
Right.
And being around Howard University, and particularly its law school, I saw many of the civil rights lawyers come in and out of the school during that time. And I became a mentee of Professor Herbert O. Reed, who was trained by Charles Hamilton Houston, the way that Houston also trained Thurgood Marshall, the first African-American Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And Reed trained me, and Houston trained Reed. And so Reed trained and told me that I was the third generation. And I went on to be a civil rights lawyer in Mississippi. And I ended up as a law professor at the University of Connecticut for 22 years. And I brought, along with other distinguished lawyers, a landmark school desegregation called Sheff versus O'Neill, a school desegregation case. And Sheff was to Connecticut in ending de jure segregation in the schools, at least by their actions, as Brown was in ending segregation in the Deep South.
I've heard, and I've got people on the channel who say that there were other cases before Brown versus Board of Education.
Yes. Again, Charles Hamilton Houston had walked, using that term, about 4 or 5 cases into the courts before Brown, leading to the way. For an example, I later became the dean of the Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern University in Houston, Texas.
Yeah, I've been there.
And there's a famous case that led to Thurgood Marshall. And it was called the Heman Sweat case of Sweat versus Painter. And Heman Sweat graduated from college. He applied to go to the University of Texas Law School back in the mid-1940s. He was denied admission because of his race. He brought Thurgood Marshall down from New York to file suit in a famous case called Sweat versus Painter. And in the Sweat versus Painter case, they claimed that they tried to do like Plessy versus Ferguson said back in 1896 with separate and unequal. And they created in Texas a law school in the capital of Austin for one Black man named Heman Sweat. And they tried to make it equal with the University of Texas Law School in order to maintain that doctrine of separate and so-called equal. And the Supreme Court turned them down, and they said, no, you can't do that because it's the stigma that it's an all-Black college when he should be able to law school, when he should be able to go to the University of Texas at Austin. That was one of the cases that paved the way, decided by the Supreme Court in Sweat versus Painter in 1950. It paved the way to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 with several other similar type cases.
When you have one case, then and it's kind of, I'm sure it's not the same exact merit, but okay, they got that one case you just mentioned. Then why don't all the other cases become easy to litigate? Why do they have to go to the Supreme Court? Because you already got one precedent. What makes that different that it has to go that far?
Cases have different facts, different places, different law, different judges, different parties that sometimes distinguish themselves from other cases. But if you look at the train of cases in school desegregation, school integration, it largely begins with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, in which Homer Plessy boarded the train going from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, and he claimed that he was 7th, 8th white. But it showed you that a little dab of Dewey of Black made him a Black person. And the court said that the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause gives Sweat the right to travel on the train funded by the state, but doesn't give him any right to sit next to white people, or white people can sit in a segregated unit. And that's what led to the de jure segregation from the 1800s all the way up to 1954 with Brown. Now, Brown versus Board of Education said that de jure segregation in education was a violation of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. They came along another year after it in 1955 and said that the states must desegregate the schools by all deliberate speed because they didn't do anything for a year. In fact, they didn't do anything for the next 14 or 15 years because the real desegregation didn't take place until around 1970.
Okay, how about this one? Because you go to a Black law school like Howard, and I'm sure there were a few others, if they had those schools and those schools were just as qualified, and not just law schools, I'm talking about grade schools and all the others. Why do you, okay, the difference between separate is that they have more resources. And we're saying is give us the same amount of resources. We don't want to go to those white institutions necessarily. Is that some of the cry? Or we do want to go because we want what they also offer?
I believe that African Americans, at least, should have a choice to go to either, but both should be equal. There are 6 HBCU law schools, all of which were largely started in order to prevent Blacks from integrating white schools.
Right.
Big 6 law schools, for an example, starting from the north going south, are Howard University in Washington,
right,
the University of the District of Columbia, where I teach now, School of Law, and then down to North Carolina with North Carolina Central University.
Okay.
And then into Florida with Florida A&M Law School, and down into Louisiana with Southern Louisiana Law School, and then over to Texas with the Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern University.
This leads to, and that question leads to this one. When we talk about what happened to the Black business community, we say that one of the things that hurt us the most was integration. Can we apply that my integration hurt Black education at Black schools?
There are multiple views on that. You're right. One of the so-called advantages, although de jure segregation, Jim Crow segregation, was both evil and also was harmful to all aspects of Black culture. Nevertheless, Black culture has a certain survivorship in it. And the Blacks being segregated in a kind of image is you had the doctors living up on the hill in a fine home. But on that hill, it was all segregated. But you had the economic and other integration of Blacks all living together, who made the lowest amount of money and who made the highest amount of money, and certainly who were serviced by the businesses, as in Tulsa, the Black Wall Street.
That's right.
Until the whites committed the massacre against the people in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So there were some advantages in that, but overall, Jim Crow segregation coming from slavery and coming from post-Reconstruction has always been harmful to the African-American people.
Oh, sure. You know, I watched a movie about Thurgood Marshall, and there have been others that they've said this. They allowed them to go to some of those schools, but then they did such dastardly things like you had to sit in the hallway during class. You couldn't sit in the classroom with the other students.
Yes.
Can you cite stories like that?
That's correct. As I said before, without going into teaching an official law school class, there were about 5 or 6 cases that Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, all brought those cases in order to pave the way to Brown. But one of the cases, and one of the smart things that Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston, is they began challenging segregation in the colleges and universities.
Yes.
And by challenging the colleges and universities, you didn't get involved with the integration of small children. You also had a college and university in which the justices on the court had more of a relationship with them because they went to colleges and universities too. And in the case you mentioned, Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston challenged a university that admitted African Americans but they made them sit in the hallway
Right.
and look in the classroom. They couldn't eat in the cafeteria. They couldn't live in the dorms.
Yeah.
And so he carefully picked the kind of case to chip away at Jim Crow segregation until the foundation became weak and it finally collapsed in Brown versus Board of Education.
Have you ever had anybody threaten you for, and we're going to go into the case that you served, you alluded to it earlier. Has anybody threatened you?
Well, when I was in Mississippi from 1969 to 1973, I carried a .38 revolver.
Oh, really?
In my briefcase at all times. And there were virtually no gun control laws. You just had to have what they call now open carry. So if I was walking down the street in the town, including the one where I lived, and I saw the sheriff or police person coming, I would take my revolver out of my briefcase and I would stick it in my waistband. And because it was so long, the butt would stick all out. And all they would do was say hello. And I would say hello and keep on walking by. At home, I had a 30-06. The 30-06 rifle, a powerful and accurate rifle, was the one that Byron de la Beckwith used to assassinate Medgar Evers from about 100 meters away. And so I wanted the most powerful and most accurate weapon like that assassin used on Medgar Evers to protect me and to protect my wife. And I had a 30-aught and I had a 20 gauge shotgun, double barrel.
Really?
And when I got to Mississippi, as much as the Black people were in support of Dr. Martin Luther King and nonviolence, they also were very smart to protect their self-defense at home and very quiet about it. And they adopted me as a new African-American civil rights lawyer located in North Mississippi, Oxford, where the University of Mississippi. And they said, come on over here. We're going to help you protect yourself and we're going to help protect you too. And we're going to show you how to use guns.
So did you ever have a scary moment?
Oh, yes, I was threatened on a number of occasions.
Oh, really?
In fact, I was arrested and put in jail within less than 1 year after being in Mississippi and bringing civil rights cases. And they arrested me for a felony that threatened to convict me and send me to prison and disbar me from practicing law. We were able to beat the case legally, but that was the kind of threats that I faced.
Okay. And at this time, you were in your 30s or something like that.
I was 25 to 28 years old.
But they never came to your house, did they?
No, they never came to my house because I was known, like we used to say in the Cold War between the United States and Russia, I was engaged in détente. So if you came over my house and we were having a talk like this today, and I heard my white neighbor shoot off his gun, I'd say, let's take our conversation all out back. Maybe we'll post a few targets and we pull out my shotgun and my 30-06 and we fire it off and he would know where he lives, that I have weapons too where I live. So everybody knew I was armed.
And now some of it was because you were a civil rights lawyer. Some of the other was just being a Black man.
Yes, I was taught, quite frankly, in Mississippi, how to be a good Black man.
To not say something, to not irritate them, that kind of thing.
I was just taught to be a good civil rights lawyer like Thurgood Marshall.
Yeah. A couple more as we move along the timeline. Who pays a civil rights lawyer? I mean, how do you make a living when all I'm asking, I don't have much money, and I'm asking you to help me with my rights? Can I ask that question?
Certainly. Certainly going back to the days of Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley, who was the only Black woman lawyer in the Brown versus Board of Education team. And she was from Connecticut. And she became one of my mentors too, since I was from Connecticut. And she went on to become the first African-American United States Federal District Court judge in New York. And she was also a president of the Manhattan Borough She was the first Black female New York senator. And she even at one time became the head of the big financial board in Manhattan. And they got paid by nonprofit organizations such as the NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund, just like many civil rights lawyers still
Okay.
work for organizations. And then other civil rights lawyers like Johnny Cochran both brought civil rights cases, but they brought $1 million private cases too in order to get paid.
I got you. Now, when you were in Mississippi, what is a civil rights case? Give me an example of a civil rights case that you might have had, an ordinary case or whatever.
There are 6 basic civil rights. I moved it up now to 8 that I teach in my class and that I practice. And the 6 transactional civil rights when it comes to lawsuits, not necessarily any order of preference, but due to the law, are voting and education and employment and housing and criminal justice and self-help, protests, marches, picketing. And I've added 2 in the last couple of years. One is marriage equality with gay marriages, and now health after the Affordable Care Act was upheld by the United States Supreme Court. Those are some of the major civil rights types of cases.
So what happens in a civil rights case is, under those 8 areas, somebody has tried to discriminate against you, pay you less, fire you unjustly, things of that sort.
You're correct. They discriminate against you on the basis of race. And you can extend the civil rights laws now beyond just race and ethnicity to include domestic, international citizenship, religion, gender, elderly.
I got you.
LGBTQ.
Yeah, I
and
got
more.
you. Have you ever had to do anything with, because they liked you so well, what have you, in terms of criminal defense?
I have represented many criminal defendants. In one of my biggest cases, I represented a group called the Republic of New Africa. They came to Mississippi in the early 1970s claiming that they were a sovereign nation and that they wanted the United States to turn over all the southern states to them. The police raided their home on a false pretense one morning and shot at them both with tear gas and with bullets. The group didn't know who came and why, and they had a plan to crawl into a bunker beneath the first floor of their house, and they took arms in self-defense. And one of the defendants shot and killed a police officer in Mississippi in 1971, right between the eyes and the forehead. I represented them in a murder case. I saved them from the death penalty, and they were released from jail within 10 years.
Oh, really? There's a case, I'm out of Detroit. There's a case here in Detroit. There's a doctor, Dr. Sweet, who he moved into a white neighborhood, and the white people didn't want it. Then one night they come to show up at his house. He shoots back. He ends up, I guess they end up killing somebody. And they, he's a, very well-known, respected doctor, and they took him to jail for that. As I remember, he got off on that case.
That's right. Self-defense, protecting of your home.
Well, now let's go up to the case that you talked about, the one in the education case in Connecticut. What was the basis of that you can tell us?
The basis of that case, brought in 1989, decided by the Connecticut Supreme Court in 2006. Excuse me, in 1996, brought in 1989, decided in 1986. It was a unique case because it was brought in the state courts instead of the federal courts. It was brought under the state constitution instead of the federal constitution. By the way, only 20 years after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the United States Supreme Court decided a case called Milliken versus Bradley involving Detroit, Michigan. And Milliken versus Bradley was decided in 1974. And Milliken said that the court can't order a broader inter-district plan between Detroit and its suburban districts, mainly white, in order to achieve equal educational opportunity, not only diversity, but opportunity for academic achievement, unless the plaintiffs can prove that the suburban districts caused the segregation in the nearly all Black places like Detroit. And that set back Brown versus Board of Education because the court didn't recognize any inter-district remedies. We came along in the 1990s with the Sheff case based upon state court and based upon the state constitution, and Connecticut had a unique amendment to the Constitution that prohibited discrimination and segregation, quote unquote, on the basis of race and the exercise of a fundamental right. And the case is called Sheff versus O'Neill, decided by the Connecticut Supreme Court in 1996. And it's the only case in which the court allowed the plaintiffs to prove the case by what is called de facto segregation, not de jure segregation by law. Today, there is no de jure segregation by law, but de facto segregation exists in every city, in every state. More so today are schools segregated and unequal than they were in the 1950s at the time of Brown versus the Board of Education. Back to the Connecticut case called Sheff versus O'Neill, the court held that it was the district boundary line between the urban district that's largely non-white and has the highest percentage of poor children, and the suburban districts, which were predominantly white, high achieving, and more economically diverse, if not affluent. And the court held that that district boundary line between urban districts and suburban districts was the cause of the segregation for both, and was the only case to approve an inter-district remedy to overcome that case from Detroit, and found that the remedy has to include assigning students to schools over district division lines between urban and suburban, both in school districts and municipalities.
Let me ask you this: when you in these cases, how do they start? Do they start at a lower court, or do you automatically appeal them to the Supreme Court? What's usually the order?
Yes, all civil rights cases start at the local level, either a local federal district court or a local state court. All of the cases in states proceed to the Supreme Court of that state. And in the federal system, they all go by the federal courts of appeals, and they ultimately request what is called a writ of certiorari to go to the United States Supreme Court.
So like the case that you spoke about in Connecticut that you did, they started at what court? Then how long did it take the Supreme Court? What happened?
We took it from the state trial court. The court bypassed the intermediate court and went to the Connecticut Supreme Court. It ended at the Connecticut Supreme Court because it was all based upon state law. So It didn't have to go to the United States Supreme Court for any federal law.
When it was at the lower court, did they rule against you?
Yes, we lost at the trial level and we appealed it to the Supreme Court, and we won at the Supreme Court.
Just a couple more. When you lost at the trial level, was that just racist on their part to let you lose, do you think?
No, I just think it was a state court judge.
That's what I mean, yeah.
That was overwhelmed with the amount of issues at hand and dealing with a major civil rights case, because state courts hadn't had the kind of experience the federal courts went through, especially during the civil rights era.
Since I got a guy like you on the channel, let me ask you this. how much preparation did it take for you to, when you were going right before the first day, you got opening remarks or whatever, when you filed it, it's 2-3 months or what have you, reading a whole bunch of cases before you do your opening remarks at the trial. How does that go?
In this case, along with a number of other cases, you often prepare years for the case.
Oh,
So for an example,
really?
we brought the case in 1989. I moved to Connecticut in 1976 after being a civil rights lawyer in Mississippi and bringing school desegregation cases. And I just rode around. At the time, children went to school in the morning, particularly in Hartford, and looked at their color and looked at where they lived. And I came back at the time school gets out around 3 o'clock and looked at where they went home. And I could immediately see the schools were segregated. And we went for about 6 or 7 years studying it, talking to everybody we could before we brought the case. And when we decided to bring the case in 1989, we had a dream team for the lawyers, including the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in New York City, the American Civil Liberties from New York City, the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund from New York City, in Connecticut, the Connecticut ACLU, the Connecticut Legal Services, and we had the top appellate lawyer in the state who was an adjunct professor where I taught at the University of Connecticut, and I joined the rest, and we brought it with a big legal team. It took us 3 years to prepare the case for the most part between 1989 and we went to trial in 1992. And the case was decided in 1996 after going through the appellate courts.
Oh, okay. Let me ask you this. When you won, how did that feel?
It felt great. It felt like a landmark decision, the Brown versus Board of Education, to try and break the back of de facto segregation.
Did the other attorneys shake your hand?
Yes. And one of the lead attorneys was a man named Richard Blumenthal, who was the Attorney General. Now he's a United States Senator from Connecticut. And we often have very friendly conversations, even though he lost and I won.
Let me ask you one more. How about this one? Did your parents get a chance to see you finish law school and that kind of thing?
Yes, they lived while I went to law school at Howard. They lived while I was in Mississippi. When I left Mississippi, I went to San Francisco and I practiced law for 4 years out there, closely associated with the former mayor, Willie Brown, and Congressman Ron Dellums, and many more in California, including Johnny Cochran. And I left San Francisco in 1977 to return to my home state to become the first African-American law professor at the University of Connecticut Law School. And my parents were still living when I was there.
I don't know, maybe we've already kind of answered. Is there a ha-ha moment for you somewhere along this? I'm on the right track. You couldn't sleep one night. I like myself, any of that kind of thing.
Well, I've always adopted what I call intellectual mentors, leading people like W.E.B. Du Bois. And I had many mentors in the law and beyond, but I always followed this motto from Charles Hamilton Houston, like my mentor who was taught by Houston said, keep one foot in the classroom teaching law and keep one foot in the courtroom bringing civil rights cases. And I've been in the law now for 52 years. And now I'm going to say goodbye to you.
Yes.
And to say
let me do
you.
this as I got 30 seconds. Everybody, I hope y'all paid attention to what my man had to say.
I'm just a humble servant for the peoples. Notice that plural on the plural.
To you, my brother, I say this with all sincerity. Thank you so very much for coming on the channel and sharing this with us. I want you to stay strong, stay safe, stay on your grind. I love what you're doing and what you have done throughout your career, giving your life, really kind of giving it for other people, for strangers. And doing that, I say thank you again. With that, I'll say bye-bye. Strong inspirations. Here we go once again. Thank you.
Oh, peace and power.
There you go. Bye-bye.